So I'm presenting these slides on behalf of Toby Lee, my colleague, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. Let's just check whether I can actually go up and down. How do I go back? So I'm just giving a brief overview about some data that collected by the centre where I work, the Centre for Social Research and Health, and the Kirby Institute from the Gay Community Periodic Surveys, which I lead with Garrett. Just giving a sense of trends in particularly illicit drug use among gay and bisexual men in Australia and how that compares to their heterosexual peers. Now, Toby made some notes here about there's actually been a long struggle over about 20 years to try and get better collection about sexual identity in national reporting systems. So often we were quite in the dark, and I know there are people here in the room who've been actively involved in that fight to try and get some collection about sexual orientation or sexual identity. They are now included to some degree in the National Drug Strategy Household Survey, which is one of the main sources of data about drug use in Australia, and the National Survey of Mental Health and Wellbeing. It took a long time to get those indicators in there. And there are some other population health surveys. An ongoing struggle now is also about collecting more information on gender identity, particularly for people with non-binary gender or transgender identity. That issue continues. Government health services don't typically collect sexual identity in their minimum data sets, although NADA, which is actively involved in monitoring drug services, now does collect sexual identity, and we're interested in looking at that. And the census is largely inadequate because there's no reliable national data on the characteristics of LGBTI people broadly constituted. So this obviously has policy and practice implications about not being able to actually characterise the population health issues that we're faced with, and which we know from our work may be present. So, get it to go forward in one way. This is some work that Toby has done with colleagues at NDARC, the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre, about comparing rates of drug use in heterosexual men from the National Drug Strategy Household Survey and gay and bisexual men. And it's a busy table, but the main point here is it's looking at lifetime rates of use for tobacco and alcohol, legal substances, and then illegal ones. Lifetime rates of use and recent use in the previous year. The main point is that gay and bisexual men tend to report similar rates of use of alcohol and tobacco, but much higher rates of use of illicit substances and also the non-medical use of pharmaceutical drugs. And that's most obvious in the recent use in the past year. And obviously ones that we pay particular attention to because it's not also just the harms of drug use, but potential risks for HIV and other bloodborne viruses. Gay and bisexual men are much more likely than heterosexual men to report the use of sex-related drugs such as ecstasy or methamphetamine. It really does not want to wait. From the same study, we also can look at substance use that may present a risk or a need for treatment or intervention. And so this is looking at high-risk drinking or daily drinking, weekly cannabis use, driving under the influence of alcohol, and ever attending drug treatment services. And you can see on the drinking and cannabis related measures, heterosexual men and gay and bisexual men report similar levels of potential harm. There isn't a particular difference there. However, gay and bisexual men are much more likely to report alcohol or other drug treatment. And that's probably related to the fact they report higher levels of use of the other substances that were on the previous table. So these are some data from studies that we have conducted here at UNSW compared with the National Household Survey. These just reiterate the point in the Sydney Gay Community Periodic Survey, the Health in Men cohort study, which was completed a number of years ago, and the National Household Survey that gay men in particular are much more likely to report any drug use and then the use of what is sometimes referred to as party drugs, ecstasy, cocaine, speed, and so on. And rates of amyl nitrate and marijuana or cannabis use are higher, and rates of injecting tend to be higher. This is looking at trends in the gay community periodic surveys, but nationally, over the last 5 years. And it's also showing trends in drug use by status. And the main point here is that HIV positive men, so men who are diagnosed with HIV, are consistently more likely to report any drug use in the past 6 months than their HIV negative and untested peers. Okay, this is very busy. I had to look at this twice to work out what was going on. So this shows the most commonly used drugs that we collect in the gay community periodic surveys. Once again, this is national trends. I mean, the main point, on the right-hand side, you can see which drugs there has been a significant change in the last 5 years, but most of those changes are qualitatively not very big. Amyl or poppers is at the top. That's the most commonly used drug reported by gay and bisexual men, followed by cannabis. And then ecstasy, the story there for actually the last 15 years has been declining levels of ecstasy use. Well, when you speak to gay men, that's usually because they say you can't get hold of it and it's crap. And then the other drugs, speed, crystal use reported there, it's a bit difficult to see, by around 10% of gay and bisexual men, and that's relatively stable. And then lower levels of use of GHB, ketamine, and heroin. We also ask about the use in the gay community periodic surveys. We also ask about what gay men use drugs for, and in particular we ask them about using party drugs like ecstasy or cocaine for sex, and whether they've also taken drugs and had group sex at the same time. And the reason we've asked about these for probably about a decade is because we know that men who engage in those practices regularly are at high risk of HIV seroconversion. This is showing those practices divided by HIV status. And once again, HIV positive men are much more likely to report these practices. So you can see they're at the top. Around a third of the HIV positive men who take part in the surveys say they've engaged in any party drug use and sex. And around a quarter of HIV negative men report the same thing. Smaller groups report drug use and group sex. About a similar level, about 1 in 5, both positive and negative men reporting that practice. And then smaller groups again who report any injecting drug use, so regardless of whether it's used for sex or not. But you can see there's a very big disparity that HIV positive men are much more likely to report any injecting compared with their HIV negative peers. Okay, so Toby had a look at some of the kind of just general points about alcohol and other drug use among gay and bisexual men. Some of our British colleagues, like Fiona Measham, who's a very well-known name in drug research, have characterised gay and bisexual men as early adopters of emerging drug trends. So if there's a new drug trend on the market, gay and bisexual men are quite likely to experiment with it. Gay and bisexual men who are drug users, often when compared to other drug users, often appear to be have higher levels of education and higher levels of full-time employment. However, gay and bisexual men, somewhat contradictorily, who use drugs at high levels appear to be more likely to develop problems from use or drug dependence and to report mental health problems. When studies of gay and bisexual men and drug use are conducted, they typically find that the highest risk appears for drug dependence and other problems appears to be reported by men who are diagnosed with HIV and bisexual men in comparison to gay identified men. The sex and drug use risk practices that gay men report or engage in at the same time can be associated with bloodborne viruses like HIV and hepatitis C. However, one of the weaknesses in the field, and this is one of the things that's really good about Flux, is that they're typically very poor measures of drug-related harm. So in the drug field, it's very standard to have standardised measures of drug-related harm and to try and assess risk of dependence and risk of mental health problems or impact on daily life. In the sexual behaviour field, levels of drug use tend to be reported, but drug-related harm does not tend to be well assessed. And that is an ongoing problem. It's recognised, but it seems to be very difficult to change. Various theories have been offered as to why gay and bisexual men report high levels of drug use. So one of the commonly reported theories is the minority stress theory. So it's the idea that basically growing up gay or bisexual in a largely heterosexual society puts people under stress, and being under can mean that you suffer from homophobia or stigma and discrimination, and that can lead to high levels of drug use for escape or for solidarity or for other reasons. Also, the way gay and bisexual cultures, particularly in high-income countries, the way they're organised tend to be around nightlife, around bars and nightclubs and dance parties and other events, and alcohol and other drug use tend to be normalised at those in those locations. Particularly since the advent of HIV, there has been a particular feature of using party drugs, particularly in large communal events, as a symbol of defiance and identity and belonging, which our colleague Kane Race has written about very eloquently. And more recently, there's been a big focus on the use of drugs in sexual contexts, which is sometimes referred to as chemsex, or party and play, or various other things. And I know that's a big focus of this study. It's probably, I mentioned Fiona Measham earlier, the British have a normalisation thesis about drug use, which is in certain contexts where drugs are available, they're accepted, they're used at high levels, and even people who don't use drugs accept their peers using drugs. Gay and bisexual men could be characterised as a population group among whom drug use is normalised. So even if gay and bisexual men who don't use drugs, they probably know that some of their peers do, and that's probably seen as acceptable. And that has certain impacts on education and health promotion. There you go. Done.